All right. Good evening, everybody. No, I don't have my shades. That's all right. Goofy eye. I just kind of want to have a little brief talk about social. Again, just 'cause I don't know. I kind of just want you guys to get a real good idea of what I'm all about, and just essentially just more or less forget everything you heard. I was gonna say everything you knew, but odds are if you've studied it, you're kind of already familiar with what I'm saying. I'm not telling you anything new. What I'm saying is, if you haven't even bothered to, look into the theoretical underpinnings or, take a look at the evidence as far as like just the way the economy is functioning, just things that like wealth inequality, for instance, then just forget pretty much everything you heard. And I mean, I'm not gonna say trust me because that it kind of just like that's kind of where we're going wrong here with Trump is just giving blind allegiance, and especially now when it's unwarranted. What I'm saying is I have no problem, you know, staying with you keeping me honest because that's just how I roll. You know what I mean? I said it the other day where and it's kind of like a philosophy of mine where if you have to lie about it, you probably have no business doing it. And so, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are some instances where it has been kind of almost like a life or death type thing. Like I was reading that biography about Churchill and Roosevelt, and up until as you know, recently in terms of the war, it was like 1940 or something like that. 40% of the people that were polled did not want the U.S. to get involved in what was then called the phony war because it's on another continent. Those Europeans are just slaughtering each other, whatever. It's none of our business. 40% of Americans that were polled did not want the U.S. to get involved under any circumstances. And then 19% were like, well, maybe if the Allies fail or what we move. So think about that. Like there were, the pretty much everything was out in the open in terms of what the Nazi platform was, in terms of like, scapegoating Jews and Kristallnacht and all that shit. You know what I mean? And like even after the war, some of the German people, especially those who lived around the concentration camps, were just like, oh well, we didn't know what he was. You know what I mean? And it's like, come on. Like I personally don't buy it. I haven't looked too much into it, just because that period of history has been beaten to the ground. But like there are some other things that it's just like, yeah, they knew. Like for instance, it said that it was the SS that was running the camps and the SS that was carrying out the final solution. When there have been accounts of soldiers recorded surreptitiously. I think it was one of those, what is it, Ghosts of the Dead or something like that. Secrets of the Dead, one of those documentaries where they recorded a Wehrmacht, which was just the regular army, not the SS, talking about like machine gunning like I think it was like a village or anything, but it was pretty much only Jews. And so that's why I kind of tend to take that thing with a grain of salt. And so now, sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent there. I don't know why I'm bringing that up. Oh yeah, just some people are, like as far as the necessity of lying. Me personally, I would prefer to state my case to the people, you guys, and just, hey, look, this is what's going on. This is what I see is happening, and this is what we need to do. And pretty much, that way I kind of retain your trust as opposed to just doing what I want to do or whatever. I mean, there will be instances, I guess, where in emergencies type of thing. But again, I have no problem accounting for what I do. I just don't want you guys to think that, oh, he's going to do whatever the hell he wants. That's not the case. You usually don't usually don't stay in power too long, or I should say it's a lot easier to stay in power when you have the people's support, when they can see that, what you're, basically that you're looking out for their interests versus just doing whatever the hell you want. Somebody in Washington might want to take that lesson. But anyway, um, so yeah, back to what we were talking about, socialism. See, the difference, and right now I'm kind of addressing more of the older people because, the younger people, they weren't bred with the same prejudices that we were. And I say we because, I was raised in, I was raised in Reagan's 80s. We came of age in the 90s, watched the Soviet Union collapse and all that good stuff. And so, up until my 20s, and I'm sure I've told this before, just, kind of bear with me. I was like reflexively, almost rabidly, like anti-communist, like it I guess you could say that the seed was planted kind of in high school when, like, I just knew that that shit is bad. Those guys hate freedom. They're all, robots basically. They all, you know what I mean? Like, just the same old shit you guys have heard. And so, like, it used to bother me to the point where, like, when we were in our 20s, there was this video game store called Game Square, and like all their racks, inside pretty much the store was like were painted red. And my buddy at the time, Mike, used to call it Red Square. Well, Red Square's in Russia. Oh, don't call it that. You know what I mean? Like, it would annoy me. Like, just fucking, ugh, don't fucking call it that. But anyway, so yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Like I said, the seed was kind of planted in high school when a history teacher uh, just basically explained what it is. And I don't remember exactly how he phrased it, but I think he put it something in terms of, and keep in mind, I'm not necessarily advocating communism, like, as, or at least as you understand it, like social, like the Soviet Union, I should say. That doesn't fly. Pretty much everyone who is more, calls himself a communist probably wouldn't want that type of a system because it's too limiting in terms of what you actually need to make an economy function. I mean, they did do it, but it was mostly by sheer force of will and because they had to. I mean, they were starting off with a backward economy. They were getting, they're basically getting robbed, I guess you could say, taken advantage of, and Stalin did speak about things like that, from all the stronger countries and shit like that for their natural resources and stuff like that. So they had to get industrialized, like, boom, quick. So that's why a lot of the things that they did were necessary. And mainly the reason that I admire them is because, again, they did like 100 years worth of industrialization. Maybe that's a slight overstatement, but they basically brought the Soviet Union screaming into the 20th century. And now I'm not going to lie, it's not like there wasn't a cost. It's just those are the types of things that you have to do in order to, advance your own society when you're working under those terms. And it's actually a good thing that they did, because if they had, instituted, quote unquote, more democratic, form of governance and, economic stewardship, they probably wouldn't have been ready for World War II. Because, like, that was the thing. They could just, like, once they got, I think it was a T-34 and all that, they just started cranking those puppies out like boom, 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 nobody's business. And that was like, that tank was something else. That tank pretty much helped to turn the war. But anyway, I digress. So that's kind of where I'm coming from historically. The way my history professor explained it was just like, it's basically just a system where more or less the owners own the means of production or something like that, or like, just the term means of production, but it'd basically be like an employee-owned business today. You know what I mean? Like, okay, what's on, what's wrong with that? You know what I mean? And so again, it usually it's the involuntary aspect that people have a problem with, right? So yeah. Anyway, so yeah, once he kind of planted that seed, I was like, wait, shit, is that what we've been tripping on? Oh, okay, well, that that doesn't sound too bad. It was just like going flashing forward a little bit, just the connotation with Red Square and the Kremlin, and just how like I mean, I would we when where I was raised and at the time I was raised, we still had kind of one leg with that 1950s or early 60s mentality, and another one toward the future, headed toward, you know what I mean? So like I was kind of like straddling the fence a little bit. So I still got a little taste of that, anti-Soviet, just like that characteristic fucking basically hatred, and let's not mince words. So just to kind of ramble at length there. I understand where you're coming from. Now, sorry, these guys. That's what I hate about this place. It's like they're so determined to kind of like squelch and obstruct, and like all we're trying to do here, all I'm trying to do is just move forward. You know what I mean? These are enemies of progress, I guess you could call it. They're not the people. You know what I mean? Because like I'm sitting here trying to educate you all, and these guys, they do it on purpose. They're fucking Cubans, and that's why like the ones that come here, you're wrong. I'm sure there's some lovely people among them, but they tend to be like virulently right wing. Like they would co-sign fucking for Hitler if he invaded, Castro's Cuba or something. You know what I mean? And I'm not exaggerating much there. You know what I mean? But whatever. Anyway, um, so yeah, back to the thing about socialism. See, before it wouldn't necessarily it wouldn't have been necessary because the way capitalism worked before was much different than it does today. I mean, I heard somebody, I don't remember who, but they asked, I think they asked their parents or something like that, or they asked somebody, just basically how things worked back in the day, and they said, basically the boss, he made more than you did, but it wasn't too much. So in other words, we didn't have these discrepancies today where like a CEO is making 200 or 300 times what the average worker makes. I mean, what our buddy Bezos, what the fuck's he? You know what I mean? Let's see, here we go again. Might be just the haters, but whatever. Anyway, so yeah, as I was saying, so yeah, back then it wasn't necessary. You didn't do things like you do today, where you would send a job overseas to China or whatever like that, or you get run out of business. No, excuse me, I'm gonna head it out so that these assholes don't get in my shot anymore. Okay, so sorry about that. Um, but yeah, it functioned a lot differently than it does today in what we call late stage capitalism. And I haven't really looked into it too much, just kind of intuitively, they would call it late stage because as it stands, it's not sustainable in itself. It's eventually going to collapse in on itself just from the inequalities that it has created on its own. See, the people who don't actually understand business, they think that like, yeah, competition and you know what I mean? Like they really don't have an idea of how capitalism actually works. They think that it's like a self-correcting system and blah blah blah. The problems just magically solve themselves, and that it's super efficient and all this shit. And it's like, no, dude, no, it just doesn't work that way. I mean, just the laws of physics kind of apply here as well, and it just does not work that way. It comes at a very high cost, and usually it's paid by the workers. Like I said, in the case of like Amazon and shit like that, they pay you $15 an hour, but they drive you like a slave. And so anyway, and that's all you get is just that $15 an hour. Meanwhile, they're raking it in hand and foot. Where before, it was kind of unconscionable to treat your workers that way. And not only that, you had stronger labor unions and all that good stuff. And so, yeah, that's kind of what's happening today. Is that, as opposed to, rather than competition being the norm, I guess you could say, or what have you, or I guess the counterweight to it, what is happening more and more is consolidation. And that's actually why I believe that Amazon needs to be broken up. Is just that, it's basically more or less a monopoly, or you know what I mean? Like, it would run afoul of just like the spirit of antitrust regulation. I mean, that's what Teddy Roosevelt did. Who do we have today that's even remotely close to a Teddy Roosevelt? Nobody. Nobody. Right? If I remember correctly, Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, but all of these like penny-wasted GOP, you know what I mean? It's like I saw a meme, like a year or two ago, I'm talking about how like the Republicans are the party of Lincoln. They're like, it's like saying Nicolas Cage is an Oscar winner. While technically true, a lot of things have happened since then. And so today's Republican Party, like, I don't think, I think Teddy Roosevelt would disown it, but that's just me. I mean, he probably wouldn't have anything to do with Trump, that's for sure. I don't think any of these presidents would. But anyway, I digress. So yeah, and all this that I'm telling you about, you can, there's a book called Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. And the thing that's remarkable about that book, why I consider it more or less authoritative, is because they went back and scoured all the data they could find. Now, granted, at the early part of the 20th century, probably the data is not going to be as accurate as it would be towards the later half, or toward the end of it, when we have more, we have computers and better methods of keeping track of data. But still, nobody has bothered to even go as exhaustively as he did, and so that's kind of why I consider that the authoritative volume on just the way things are going, and where they were and where they are going now. And it kind of points to an economic inequality that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age, which is when Teddy Roosevelt did his thing and was breaking up the trust and all that. And now that we don't have anybody willing to do that, it's basically going to reach critical mass, and that's what I see coming. It might not be in the next 5 or 10 years, but until it does happen, the thing is that working people are going to be the ones that are going to be paying the price. And you're seeing that today. I mean, just this right here, this pandemic, just kind of showed the glaring inequality in terms of not only being able to get treatment in case you were ill or get tested, or even afford a mask. I've heard, some people can't even afford a mask. But also the treatment, or as far as the inequality, and let's go beyond inequality, because inequality, it could be innocuous. You know what I mean? So, like, I recognize my superiors and whatnot. I guess that's an un-American thing to do because we're all equal, blah blah blah. But come on, really, we're as they say, some people are just more equal than others. But anyway, let's call it injustice. All right. So it mainly affected people who were, lower paid, basically on the low end of the totem pole, disproportionately. And those are exactly the type of people who can't afford to stay home and take basic precautions, just including social distancing or whatever. If they're not working in something essential, like essential, I mean like people are gonna die or something like that if they don't go to work, right? And even then, you know what I mean? Like they could cycle it. There could be different ways of getting around it, but with the current system, those people don't have an option. And so this is being more and more kind of pronounced and just coming to the forefront today with this pandemic. It's kind of just put things in just like a clear, blinding light. So, it's kind of what he was talking about. All these people that have seen their wages not keep up with their production, where before around the time, up until around Nixon, that's kind of how it worked. Like they said, the boss made a little more than you did, but it wasn't obscene like it was today. And that was around Nixon's time that changed. And that's actually also when the country kind of started, shifted to the right, like hard. But yeah, I digress. Maybe, that might be a reason why we are where we are. It's just been a game of kick the can for so long that we haven't bothered to, I guess, reconcile our political bank statements, I guess, if you will, with regards to the obligation that we have to our own people, and that's, might be why we are where we are today. But I digress. So yeah, why that? You're probably asking, like, why that type of system? And it's just like, well, the problem, if we leave things the way they are, it's not going to solve itself. Like, even with, as I don't want to say laissez-faire capitalism, but even with just like our traditional conception of capitalism, we have had to have government step in there and basically save it from itself on numerous occasions, just to kind of keep the system from collapsing. So, there was that one, unless I'm wrong, pretty much like the only time we really didn't need that was like in the post-war period, and that was actually because of government, spending and the effort that it took to win the war, to fight the war, and people investing in the war effort, getting all that money, all that. That's why those were boom times. And so, with the exception, like for instance, during the Depression, Hoover was basically doing what Trump is doing with the pandemic and with unemployment. I guess just thinking that the problem was going to solve itself, just the market forces would react, and to me that's like the stupidest like concept in the world, because if you don't make the markets move, the market, people whoever wasn't wiped out then would probably have been too scared to make moves because they don't know what the future holds. And if you don't have a government that's being proactive as far as like fixing the problems of society, like what incentive do they have, to put money out there if it's just going to end up getting lost because nobody has money to spend? You know what I mean? You might as well take that money and put it in the fireplace and set it on fire. And so that's what would have happened. That's actually one of the things that, your homie Obama, I'm just going to throw in there, but that's one of the things that Obama did right. It's just, for whatever reason, he had to fight Congress almost at every step to get it done. But yeah, now we're much deeper in the hole than we were then. And not only then, this time it's not like self-inflicted. You know what I mean? Because that's what should have happened, is that, like, as much as, I hate to say it, well, honestly, I wrote back then that we should actually nationalize those banks. And because I think that the reason for it is that, just regular consumer banking, that is, your savings, your checking accounts and whatnot, maybe even mortgages, but I'd be kind of inclined to, leave that in the private sector. But, that type of thing is such a mission critical function to our country, to our economy, that, hey, maybe the government could possibly do that as an alternative. But back then it was more as like punishment for these guys gambling like recklessly, because I was in on the ground floor of that, and let me tell you, it was bad. It was bad. So yeah, I would have nationalized all those banks and shit, and just like, okay, boom, you guys are done. You guys fucked this up. You guys are out of business. We're gonna take this shit. We're gonna fucking nurse it back to good health. And when, the profits start rolling in, they're going straight to the fucking treasury. And that's, the profits that we would have made back then would have been less taxes that you had to pay as an individual. But, that didn't happen. So, it's just, we're reaching critical mass here. It's becoming clearer and clearer by the day. And I mean, at this point, if it's probably more just like a, how should I say, like a senseless type of prejudice. You know what I mean? Because it's like it's for your benefit, and that's it. No more, no less. Like you know, I'm not very prone to ostentation. I mean, I like some nice things, just mainly to, not look like a slob and shit. And, I have some women who might have, slightly finer tastes, slightly more refined tastes and what have you. And, I wouldn't want to dress them in rags and shit. But beyond that, I'm not gonna be like Vladimir Putin, who like looted 40 billion or something like that from his own economy when they, at a time when, they more or less, I don't know if I could say couldn't afford it, but I guess maybe you could call that like reverse expropriation, because all that shit when the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't know whose it was, and so people like there was one dude, I think he tried to even like sell a nuclear sub. Can you imagine that shit? Just like walking off with like just with a nuclear sub that you're trying to like pawn off on the black market because nobody knows who owns it or nobody's enforcing the ownership and what have you. And so that's when a lot of these oligarchs came into power. Is just they just swooped on shit and fucking got it at fire sale prices, and that's where more or less his power base comes from. But anyway, I digress. It goes better. It's actually it would be interesting because all the places that have implemented communism, and I'm not like I said, I want to reiterate that we're not trying to do that, okay? But all the places that have actually skipped a step because, according to Marx, like it was supposed to be that people would demand to go from capitalism to socialism to communism, at least for my understanding. But the thing about it, it's kind of like this is where they say that he didn't understand human nature, because if you're comfortable, if you're making a decent living, and you can afford to pay your bills and buy nice things and send your kids to college and get seen by the doctor and what have you, and you're not lacking anything really, then why would you want to do that in the first place? So I guess the question is that still the case? How are you doing financially? And we can tell that in the way that just like Bernie likes to tout this, or not tout this, but he cites this all all the time, that like you could fit a group of people, the most wealthiest people in like a Gulfstream jet, and they'd own more wealth than like something like the bottom 50% of society or something like that. You know what I mean? Like just a small group of people would own more wealth than the lower half of society, many of whom have a negative net worth. In other words, if they died, the the hole that they were in financially would be deeper than the one they're buried in. So, and like, you know what I mean? And that was actually kind of coincidental with the starting with the major use of credit cards and what have you around the time that productivity and wages didn't, started to go in separate directions. Because people were still accustomed to certain lifestyles and whatnot, and if they couldn't use them, well, here comes, well, Mr. Prospect, we could help you finance that. In fact, we'll give you 90 days no payments, or a nice little toaster, or whatever the hell they get you to sign the credit card application at the retail store. And that's when people started relying more and more and more on credit as opposed to living within their means, because their means were plateauing. So that's just yet another reason as far as like why we're willing to do what's necessary to kind of ensure prosperity for everybody. And now one of the things is that, like, I mean for everybody, because that's one of the things that was LBJ's genius, is that he was able to convince either the private sector or Republicans, maybe by way of the private sector or what have you, that what was known then as the welfare state was actually good for business. And that's because it is. You see, I'm consistent. because if I tell you the truth, I'm going to tell you the same thing every time, and that way I don't have to keep tabs on lies. It works a lot easier for me. So back to what I was saying, and LBJ probably realizes this too, is that like if you give money to people who have a large propensity to consume, they're going to go out and spend it. They're going to spend it in businesses. All those rich people are going to get it back. You know what I mean? And then some. Because, at every juncture and what have you, you increase, you create value and what have you, and that's just the way that things work. So money doesn't flow down. It doesn't trickle down. Reagan and all those guys were full of shit. It doesn't trickle down. It flows up. So all we ask really of people who are wealthy is that they pay their fair share in terms of the infrastructure that they use, whether it's a postal service, whether it's a road that they use to ship, their whatever the fuck they're selling, their tchotchkes, via trucks or communications infrastructure, even like the air traffic control for their private jets or what. All that shit costs money, and so all these guys that are basically, pay, making billions of dollars tax free, like my buddy Bezos over there. Those are the parasites. Don't blame the person who's getting like $1,000 a month on a fucking welfare or social security SSI or whatever the hell or whatever. Like those people are peanuts compared to what this guy's fucking mooching off the economy. But yet when he does it for it's perfectly fine. Like you know what I mean? That's the kind of perspective. That's the kind of thing that we should, really take a look at critically. And I welcome debate. I welcome discussion. Let's just keep it respectful, just as much as I've tried to do here, and just, have an honest discussion, and, who knows where it will take us, right? Anyway, have a good night, America. Thank you for bearing with me.